concept of the ledger began, not with ink or paper, but with the cool, damp weight of river clay. It is soothing to imagine the ancient scribe of Uruk sitting in the shade of a mud brick wall, forming small geometric tokens between his fingers, a tactile process that was as steady and rhythmic as the breathing of a sleeping child. These tokens, known as calculi, were simple cones, spheres, and discs, each shape representing a specific commodity, a measure of grain, a jar of oil, or a single sheep. And as the scribe rolled the clay between his palms, he was not merely counting, but grounding the abstract idea of ownership into a physical, heavy object that could be held, stored, and verified in the silence of the temple archives. Fact 2. As the centuries drifted by with the slowness of a shifting sand dune, these loose tokens required a vessel for safekeeping, leading to the creation of the bulla, a hollow clay ball that served as the world's first sealed envelope. The process of creating a bulla was one of gentle enclosure. The scribe would take the small tokens, counting them in a low murmur, and place them inside a spherical shell of wet clay, sealing the opening with a smooth patch of mud that left no seam behind. Once dried in the warm, arid sun, this clay sphere became a silent guardian of the transaction, a heavy, rattling object that held the truth of the debt within its dark interior, protecting the information from the air, the light, and the interference of human hands, resting undisturbed on a dusty shelf for generations. Fact 3. Drifting from the hollow sphere to the flat surface, the heavy clay envelopes were eventually replaced by the cushion-like tablet, a change that brought the information out from the darkness into the soft light of the scribe's table. The instrument of this transition was the stylus, a cut reed with a triangular tip which was pressed, never dragged, into the wet surface of the tablet, creating the wedge-shaped marks we now know as cuneiform. There is a profound stillness in the image of the stylus, sinking into the yielding clay, displacing the earth to create a shadow, a record that relied on the angle of the light to be read, requiring the reader to tilt the heavy tablet slowly in the afternoon sun to reveal the rows of grain and silver recorded in the quiet ridges of the dried earth. Fact 4. As the use of these clay tablets expanded, the need for organization birthed the first archives, vast and silent rooms where thousands of dried rectangular plates were stacked in baskets of woven reed or on wooden shelves that smelled of cedar and dust. In these cool, dimly lit chambers, the air was still, disturbed only by the shuffling sandals of a librarian who moved with the slow deliberation of one who measures time and dynasties rather than hours. The tablets were arranged not by urgency, but by the steady logic of the harvest and the seasons, creating a physical landscape of data where one could run a hand along a shelf and feel the texture of a century of surplus, the jagged edges of the clay humming with the accumulated memory of ancient, quiet commerce. Across the sea in the warm, dry air of Egypt, the ledger underwent a transformation of texture, moving from the heavy rigidity of clay to the fibrous flexibility of papyrus. This material, born from the tall reeds of the Nile Delta, required a preparation process of immense patience, where the pith was sliced into thin strips, laid in overlapping layers, and pressed until the sap acted as a natural glue, bonding the fibers into a single, cohesive sheet. The result was a scroll that felt dry and crisp to the touch, a long, continuous surface that could be rolled and unrolled with a soft, rustling sound, reminiscent of dry leaves shifting in a gentle breeze, allowing the scribe to record a continuous stream of grain deliveries in a format that flowed as endlessly as the river itself. Fact 6. With the advent of the papyrus scroll, the method of inscription softened, replacing the deep impression of the stylus with the delicate, brushing stroke of the rush pen dipped in carbon ink. This ink, a simple mixture of soot, water, and gum, flowed onto the fibers of the papyrus with a glistening wetness that would slowly dry into a matte, permanent black, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. The scribe would sit cross-legged, the scroll stretched taut across his linen kilt, and apply the ink with a meditative focus, watching the liquid soak into the organic grain of the paper, a process that was silent and additive, layer upon layer of black pigment, building a structure of numbers that would outlast the stone granaries they cataloged. Fact 7. As the classical world matured, the Romans introduced a rigid structural discipline to the financial record, organizing their accounts into the Adversaria, a daily wastebook of rough notes, and the Codex Accepti et Expensi, the formal ledger of receipts and expenditures. This transition marked a move toward linearity and order, where the chaotic notes of the day were transferred, in the quiet solitude of the evening, into the permanent columns of the main ledger. The Roman accountant, working by the flickering light of an oil lamp, would take great care to align the numerals perfectly, creating a visual rhythm on the page where the vertical lines of the columns imposed a sense of calm, unshakable stability, mirroring the architectural order of the columns that held up the temple roofs outside his window. Fact 8. Following the decline of Rome, the stewardship of the ledger retreated into the monasteries of the Middle Ages, where the recording of accounts became indistinguishable from a spiritual practice, performed in the hushed scriptorium. Here, the material shifted again, this time to parchment and vellum, skins that were scraped, stretched, and chalked until they were velvety and pale, offering a surface of luxurious smoothness for the quill. The sound of the quill scratching against the vellum was the only noise in the room, a repetitive, dry friction that accompanied the slow accumulation of assets, as the monk recorded the wool yields and the honey stores with a calligraphy that turned the mundane logistics of survival into a manuscript of illuminated, quiet beauty. Fact 9. It was in the merchant houses of Renaissance Venice that the ledger achieved its perfect symmetry with the codification of double-entry bookkeeping, a system described by the friar Luca Pacioli as a method of maintaining a divine balance. In this system, every transaction was recorded twice, once as a debit and once as a credit, creating a closed loop of logic where the books must always balance to zero, a state of equilibrium that offered a profound psychological comfort to the merchant. To open the great leather-bound ledger of a Venetian house was to enter a world where no loose ends were permitted, where every weight of gold sent out on a galley ship had a corresponding entry in value returning, a mirrored reality that promised that the world was orderly, solvable, and at rest. Fact 10. The physical form of these Renaissance ledgers was designed to endure, bound in heavy, dark leather that was often reinforced with brass corners and strapped shut with metal clasps, resembling a locked chest more than a book. When the merchant unlocked the clasps, the book would groan softly as it opened, revealing pages of thick rag paper that smelled of iron gall ink and old binding paste, a scent of preservation and permanence. The act of turning these heavy pages was slow and deliberate, requiring two hands to lift the sheet, creating a gentle draft of air that carried the dust of the counting house, settling the mind into a state of deep administrative trance, where the only reality was the steady, unbroken timeline of the column and the row. Fact 11. Drifting from the ledger itself to the instrument of its creation, we consider the quill pen, which defined the auditory landscape of the early modern counting house with its rhythmic scratching whisper before a single number could be entered. The clerk engaged in the quiet ritual of preparing the feather, usually plucked from the left wing of a goose, so that the natural curve would nestle comfortably in the right hand, curving away from the eye. The barrel of the feather was hardened in hot sand to turn the opaque white keratin into a clear amber-like material, which was then sliced with a small sharp knife, the origin of the term penknife, to create a nib of precise flexibility. This preparation was slow and exacting, requiring a steady hand to shape the tip so that it would hold just enough ink to complete a long column of figures without blotting, creating a bond between the scribe and his organic tool that was constantly renewed through the gentle friction of maintenance. Fact 12. Once the quill was shaped, it was dipped into the inkwell, a small vessel often made of heavy lead glass or pewter to prevent it from tipping, filled with a dark, viscous fluid known as iron gall ink. This ubiquitous liquid was born from a slow chemical marriage between the tannic acids found in oak galls, small round growths gathered from the forest floor, and iron salts mixed with gum arabic and water to create a solution that was not merely a stain, but a reactive agent. When first applied to the paper, the ink appeared a pale, watery purple, but as it rested on the page and drank in the oxygen from the still air of the room, it gradually darkened to a deep, indelible black, a slow-motion chemical maturation that mirrored the aging of the accounts themselves. The smell was faintly metallic and earthy, a scent that lingered on the fingers of the clerk, marking him as a keeper of records even when he was far from his desk. Fact 13. Before the invention of absorbent blotting paper, the drying of this ink required a process involving a fine powder known as pounce, typically made from ground cuttlefish bone or sandarac resin. After completing a page of entries, the clerk would take a shaker, often resembling a silver salt cellar with a perforated top, and gently sprinkle the fine white dust over the wet script, watching as the granules coated the glistening black lines. The sound of the sand hitting the paper was like a soft, dry rain, a microscopic percussion that signaled the pause between tasks, as the powder sat for a moment, absorbing the excess moisture through capillary action. Once the ink was set, the clerk would lift the heavy ledger and tilt it, allowing the sand to slide off into a wooden trough for reuse, leaving the surface of the paper dry, textured, and ready to be turned without the risk of smudging the history written there. Fact 14. The paper that received this ink was not the flimsy, bleached pulp of the modern era, but a robust material known as laid paper, crafted individually by hand from a thick slurry of linen and cotton rags. If one were to hold a blank page of a 17th century ledger up to the light of a window, the internal structure of the sheet would be revealed. A grid of faint, translucent lines left by the wire mesh of the mold in which it was formed, crossed at intervals by darker chain lines where the wire was stitched to the frame. This texture provided a microscopic tooth that grabbed the nib of the pen, offering a subtle resistance that prevented the hand from slipping, while the surface was treated with animal gelatin or sizing, which ensured the ink sat crisp on top of the fibers rather than bleeding into them, maintaining the integrity of the numbers for centuries. Fact 15. To navigate this textured surface, the handwriting style evolved into the disciplined elegance of copperplate, a script that prioritized uniformity and legibility over any individual expression or flourish. The clerk was trained to hold the pen at a specific, shallow angle, applying pressure on the downstrokes to spread the nib tines and create a thick, bold line, and lifting the pressure on the upstrokes to leave a hairline trail of ink. This rhythmic modulation of pressure required a breathing technique similar to meditation. The clerk would exhale on the heavy stroke and inhale on the light, creating a physical cadence that synced with the visual loop and flow of the letters. The result was a page that looked mechanically produced, a sea of identical sloping curves, where the personality of the writer was entirely submerged beneath the calm, repetitive perfection of the form, ensuring that the data remained neutral and objective. Fact 16. Guiding this script were the ruled lines of the ledger, a visual cage of red and blue that imposed a strict Cartesian logic onto the blank page. In the early days, these lines were drawn by hand using a straight edge and red ink, a tedious preparatory task that required immense patience to ensure the parallel spacing was exact to the millimeter. Vertical lines, typically in a striking vermilion red derived from cinnabar, created the columns for pounds, shillings, and pence, acting as the walls that kept the digits from drifting into chaos, while the horizontal lines, often a faint blue, provided the floor upon which the entries rested. This grid was not merely decoration, but a cognitive scaffolding. The eye could relax, knowing that every number had a designated home, a rectangular cell where it would sit in perpetuity, framed by the reassuring, contrasting colors of the room. Fact 17. The physical station where this work occurred was the high desk, a piece of furniture designed for standing or perching, constructed from dense, dark woods like mahogany or oak that absorbed the silence of the room. The surface of the desk was sloped at a precise angle to meet the eye, reducing the strain on the neck, and was often worn smooth and lustrous by the friction of woolen sleeves rubbing against the grain over decades of service. At the base, a brass footrail offered a cold, solid resting place for the shoe, allowing the clerk to shift his weight imperceptibly from left to right as the hours elongated. There was a sense of permanence in these desks. They were heavy, immovable objects that anchored the clerk to the floor, creating a dedicated island of commerce where the only movement was the travel of the hand across the page and the slow settling of dust on the ledge. Fact 18. Illuminating this workspace before the advent of the electric bulb was the gas lamp, a fixture that introduced a specific auditory and visual atmosphere to the late evening hours of the counting house. The gas ceased to be a silent, invisible force and became a presence, hissing softly as it escaped the jet and burned within a glass globe, casting a warm, yellow pool of light that was focused entirely on the ledger, leaving the rest of the room in soft, indistinct shadow. This light was steady but living, flickering slightly with the drafts of the room, making the shadows of the clerk's hand dance gently across the columns of figures. The warmth radiating from the lamp was a comfort in the drafty halls of commerce, creating a small, thermal sphere of concentration that encouraged a drowsy, hypnotic focus on the tip of the pen and the wet ink glistening in the amber glow. Fact 19. At the conclusion of the day's recording, the ledger was not left on the desk, but was retired to the sanctuary of the iron safe or strong room, a heavy, windowless chamber designed to survive fire and collapse. The door of the safe was a masterpiece of engineering, swinging on massive, oiled hinges that moved with a heavy, fluid silence. The steel, painted in dark enamels, often detailed with gold pinstriping. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dry paper and cold metal, a preservative atmosphere where the temperature remained constant, regardless of the season. Turning the key or spinning the dial to lock the safe involved a series of mechanical clicks, tactile confirmations that the day's labor was sealed away, protected behind layers of steel and concrete, resting in a dark, undisturbed sleep until the next morning's reopening. bottom of a page was finally reached, the clerk performed the ritual of casting up, summing the long columns of figures to produce a total that would be transferred to the top of the next folio. This moment of transition, known as carrying forward, was a bridge between the past and the future, where the accumulated weight of the previous transactions was compressed into a single dense number. The clerk would write "carried forward" in a flowing script. At the bottom right corner, turn the heavy page, feeling the breeze of the paper moving the air, and write "brought forward" at the top left of the new sheet. It was a seamless continuation, a guarantee that nothing was lost in the turning, that the narrative of value was an unbroken chain, linking the first page to the last, a cycle of accumulation that proceeded with the inevitability of the tide. Fact 21. Before the standardization of the wooden crate or the steel container, the fundamental unit of ancient logistics was the amphora, a ceramic vessel born from the earth and designed with a geometry of pure utility. The shape was not accidental, but evolutionary, featuring a tapered, pointed bottom that allowed the heavy jar to be embedded securely into the soft sand of a warehouse floor or the deep ballast of a ship's hold, preventing it from rolling with the motion of the waves. To create one was a rhythmic act of turning. The potter would throw the heavy clay on a slow wheel, pulling the walls upward into a thick, robust curve that could withstand the pressure of stacking, forming two vertical handles, the ears at the neck, which allowed dockworkers to lift the vessel with a coordinated, swaying heave that distributed the immense weight of the olive oil or wine contained within. Fact 22. Once filled, the amphora required a seal that was as enduring as the ceramic itself, leading to the development of the pozzolana stopper, a plug of lime and volcanic ash that hardened into a stone-like cap. This sealing process was a ritual of closure. The merchant would press a disc of terracotta or cork into the neck, and then pour a layer of molten pine resin or pitch over the top, a thick black liquid that smelled of deep forests and wood smoke. As the resin cooled, it contracted and gripped the porous clay, creating an airtight bond that halted the aging of the wine inside, preserving the liquid in a state of suspended animation for decades, waiting in the cool darkness of the cellar for a future moment that might be years away from the hand that poured the seal. Fact 23. The destination for these millions of vessels was the Horium, the great public warehouse of Rome, a structure designed not for beauty, but for the preservation of grain and stability. These buildings were massive, windowless fortresses of brick and concrete, with walls of immense thickness intended to insulate the interior from the sweltering heat of the Mediterranean summer, keeping the air inside permanently cool and dry, to prevent dampness from rising from the earth, the great enemy of grain. The floors were suspended on short brick pillars known as suspensori, creating a hollow space beneath the floorboards where air could circulate freely. Walking into a Horium was like entering a cave. The temperature dropped, the light dimmed, and the sound of the city was muffled by the stored surplus of the empire, a silent testament to the logistical foresight that kept the capital fed. Fact 24. Inside these warehouses, the loose grain was managed with the modius, a standardized bucket of bronze or iron that served as the unwavering judge of quantity. The act of measuring was hypnotic and repetitive. The worker would plunge the modius into the mountain of wheat, listening to the dry, rushing sound of the kernels sliding against the metal, a sound like heavy rain falling on a roof. Once filled, the grain was leveled off with a straight stick called a ruttle, struck across the rim to ensure that the volume was exact, not a kernel more or less. This leveling was a moment of pause, of physical enforcement, of fairness, ensuring that every measure that left the warehouse was identical to every other, creating a uniformity that allowed the complex economy to function without dispute. Fact 25. As trade routes expanded northward into Gaul and the Rhineland, the ceramic amphora gave way to the wooden barrel, a masterpiece of tension and compression crafted by the cooper. The creation of a barrel was a noisy process that resulted in a silent object. Oak staves were heated over a fire to make them pliable, then bent and winched together until they formed a bulging cylinder held in place by iron hoops driven down the hammer. The magic of the barrel lay in its interaction with the liquid it held. As the wine or ale soaked into the wood, the staves would swell slightly, pressing against each other with immense force to seal the joints perfectly. A well-made barrel was a self-sealing vessel, a watertight traveler that rolled easily along the dock, moving heavy volumes with the gentle, rumbling momentum of a wheel. Fact 26. The loading of these barrels into the hull of a wooden merchant ship required a specific spatial intelligence known as stevedoring, a puzzle of weight and balance played out in the dim light of the lantern. The goal was to pack the cargo so tightly that it became a single, solid mass, unable to shift, even in the roughest storm. A technique called blocking and bracing. Workers would wedge soft wood and old rope, known as dunnage, into the small gaps between the curved bellies of the barrels, creating a friction fit that silenced the cargo. When the hatch was finally battened down, the hold became a dark, creaking sanctuary where hundreds of tons of goods lay motionless, pressing against the curvature of the hull, riding the ocean swell as a unified, sleeping weight. Fact 27. Beneath the cargo, deep in the bilge, where the sunlight never reached, lay the ballast, the invisible foundation of the ship's stability. These were not goods for sale, but heavy stones, lead pigs, or iron bars placed with deliberate care along the keel to lower the center of gravity and prevent the ship from heeling over. The placement of ballast was a silent art. Too much weight, and the ship would be sluggish and wet. Too little, and it would be flighty and dangerous. Once placed, these stones would often remain untouched for the life of the vessel, dark and wet, covered in the slime of the bilge water, serving as the hidden, heavy anchor that allowed the ship to remain upright against the force of the wind. permanent, grounding counterweight to the volatility of the sea. Fact 28. Accompanying every shipment was the bill of lading, a document that evolved from a simple list into a legally binding promise of safe delivery. In the quiet offices of the port, the master of the ship would sign this paper, acknowledging the receipt of the goods in good order and condition, a phrase that has echoed through logistics for centuries. The paper itself traveled separately from the goods, often carried by a faster courier or a different vessel, arriving before the cargo to announce its coming. It was a proxy for the physical objects, a sheet of parchment that held the value of the wine and the wool, passed from hand to hand in the coffee houses of London or the piazzas of Venice, representing a trust that the goods were effectively already there, merely waiting for the slow time of the voyage to catch up with the speed of the contracts. Fact 29. Upon arrival, if there was any suspicion of illness from the port of origin, the ship would enter the lazaretto or quarantine, a period of enforced stillness that typically lasted 40 days, 40 giorni. The ship would drop anchor in a designated, isolated harbor, flying the yellow flag that signaled "Do not approach," and simply wait. The crew would pace the decks, the cargo would sit in the hold, and the ship would swing slowly on its anchor chain with the turning of the tides. It was a time of suspended logistics, where the urgency of commerce was overruled by the necessity of safety, a long bureaucratic pause, where the only activity was the counting of days and the observation of health, allowing the vessel to be purified by the simple passage of time. Fact 30. Finally, the goods would reach the customs house, the Dogana, a grand building at the water's edge where the final transformation from cargo to commodity took place. Here, the barrels were rolled onto the scales, the bales of silk were opened for inspection, and the tax was calculated by clerks who worked with the detached efficiency of the state. The atmosphere was one of dusty formality, the air filled with the smell of wax seals and ink. The payment of the duty was the final key that unlocked the goods, allowing them to cross the threshold from the liminal space of the port into the city proper. It was the last stop in the long chain of custody, quiet, administrative stamping of papers that signaled the journey was done. The ledger was closed, and the object could finally come to rest in the hands of its owner. Fact 31. Before the dominance of paper, the financial memory of medieval England was recorded in the grain of the willow or hazel branch through the instrument known as the tally stick. The creation of a tally was a process of woodwork. The stick was harvested from the quiet, damp forests and seasoned until the wood was hard and pale. The scribe would carve notches across the width of the shaft to represent the amount of the debt. Wide, deep cuts for pounds and shallow scratches for pennies. Working with a small blade, it pared away the bark in curling strips. Once the notches were cut, the stick was split lengthwise down the center, a cracking sound that severed the wood into two matching halves. The stock, which was kept by the creditor, and the foil given to the debtor. When the debt was paid, the two pieces were brought back together, the grain and the notches aligning perfectly in a silent, physical verification that no forgery could replicate, a wooden handshake that clicked softly as the two halves reunited. Fact 32. In the great halls of the Exchequer, the calculation of the king's revenue took place not on paper, but upon a table covered with a coarse woolen cloth, dyed a deep matte green. This cloth was ruled with lines to create a grid of squares resembling a chessboard, a visual field that absorbed the lamplight and reduced the glare for the counters. The officials, wearing heavy robes that muffled their movements, would place small counters or jettons into the squares to represent values, sliding them from column to column with the soft shushing sound of metal moving against wood. It was a tactile arithmetic. There was no scratching of pens, only the rhythmic placement and removal of the counters, a silent game of accumulation where the wealth of the nation was mapped out in the quiet interplay of shadows and tokens on the dark green fabric. Fact 33. Traveling further back to the origins of calculation, we find the abacus, a device of pure mechanical simplicity that relies on the smoothness of the bead and the rod. The frame was typically crafted from polished hardwood, worn satiny by the oils of the hand, holding rods of brass or bamboo that were perfectly straight and cool to the touch. The beads, shaped like flattened spheres to fit comfortably between the thumb and forefinger, were moved with a distinct, clicking rhythm, clack, clack, pause, a sound that functioned as a metronome for the mind. The operator did not need to look at the numbers. The position of the beads was felt as a spatial pattern, a tactile landscape where the answer to a complex sum arrived not as a written figure, but as a satisfying geometric arrangement of wood and metal coming to rest at the bottom of the frame. Fact 34. When the value of the coin was in doubt, it was brought to the assay office, a place of intense heat and stillness, where the purity of gold was tested by fire. The assayer would scrape a tiny shaving of the metal, a delicate curl of gold, and place it into a couple, a small, porous vessel made of bone ash, placed inside the muffle furnace. The cupel glowed with a radiant orange heat, a silent, contained inferno that melted the sample into a shimmering beam. As the assayer watched through a small viewing hole, the impurities were absorbed into the porous bone ash, leaving only the pure, noble metal behind, a bright, trembling droplet that would cool into a perfect sphere. The process was slow and chemical, a purification ritual that stripped away the dross to reveal the quiet, incorruptible truth of the element. Fact 35. The production of the coin itself, before the roar of steam power, was achieved with the screw press, a massive machine of iron and bronze that stood like a statue in the mint. The workers would swing the great weighted arms of the press, a motion that was heavy and pendulum-like, driving the upper die down with immense, crushing force. The blank disk of silver, softened by annealing, would be squeezed between the dies, the metal flowing like a stiff liquid into the negative spaces of the engraving. There was no banging hammer, just deep, groaning compression as the metal yielded, imprinting the profile of the monarch and the date into the cold silver. The finished coin would drop into a basket with a clear, ringing bell tone, the sound of density and completion that signaled the birth of a new unit of value. Fact 36. To protect the integrity of the coin from the clippers who would shave the edges, the process of milling was introduced, adding a serrated texture to the rim of the currency. This was a detail of tactile security. One could run a thumb along the edge of a fresh shilling and feel the sharp, precise ridges, a continuous band of friction that proved the coin was whole. The machine that cut these grooves worked with a slow, grinding precision, turning the coin against a steel collar. The result was an object that felt complete and finished in the hand, a perfect circle bounded by a rough, defensive border that deterred theft by its very texture, ensuring that the weight of the silver remained constant as it passed from the cold counting table to the warm leather of the purse. Fact 37. As the economy dematerialized from metal to paper, the banknote emerged, printed on a substrate that was more fabric than paper, a blend of cotton and linen rag that was tough, fibrous, and distinct to the touch. This paper was not smooth and dead like modern printer paper. It had a rattle, a specific crispness and sound when snapped between the fingers, and a texture that was slightly raised where the intaglio ink lay on the surface. The printing plates were engraved with thousands of microscopic lines, creating vignettes of allegorical figures, commerce, industry, agriculture, that were so detailed they seemed to vibrate visually. Holding a fresh banknote was an experience of sensory complexity, feeling the ridge of the ink, the weave of the cotton, and the stiffness of the promise that the paper held the value of gold. Fact 38. Hidden within the very fibers of this paper was the watermark, a ghostly image, visible only when the note was held up to the light of a window or a candle. This feature was created during the paper-making process itself, where a wire design was stitched onto the mold, thinning the layer of pulp in that specific shape. It is soothing to imagine the paper slurry settling over the wire, the water draining away to leave a permanent, translucent memory of the bank's crest or the denomination. The watermark is a feature of silence and light. It cannot be felt, it cannot be heard. It can only be revealed by a deliberate act of looking through the object, a secret verification that exists within the wall of the paper, waiting patiently for the moment of inspection. Fact 39. For the saver, the record of accumulation was the passbook, a small booklet bound in stiff cardboard or faux leather that was kept in a drawer at home, a private mirror of the ledger at the bank. The pages were ruled with the same comforting blue and red lines as the great ledgers, and the entry of a deposit was a ritual of validation. The teller would take the book, slide it into a mechanical printer, or stamp it by hand, thump, recording the date, the amount, and the new balance in a purple or black ink that soaked into the porous paper. The book was then slid back under the glass partition. A physical object returns to its owner, heavier now with the ink of savings, a quiet, pocket-sized testament to patience and the slow, incremental building of security. Fact 40. Finally, we return to the repository of all these physical assets. The safe deposit box, a narrow drawer of metal housed within the wall of the bank vault. The box itself was a long steel cassette, cool and sleek, which slid into its designated slot with a smooth, machined friction, metal gliding on metal. The locking mechanism required a ceremony of dual authority. The guard's key and the owner's key, inserted and turned in unison to release the tumblers. Once unlocked, the box was carried to a private viewing booth, a small soundproof room with a single desk and a lamp. In this absolute privacy, the lid was lifted to reveal the contents. Birth certificates, deeds, heirlooms, resting in the dark, still air of the box, protected by layers of steel and silence, suspended outside the flow of time. Fact 41. Leaving the specific quiet of the safety deposit vault, we emerge into the grand open atmosphere of the banking hall itself, a space designed to suppress sound through the sheer scale of its volume. The architecture of the late 19th century bank was modeled on the cathedral, utilizing vast coffered ceilings that trapped the air high above the floor, cooling it and creating a hushed acoustic environment where footsteps on the marble floor echoed with a distant, hollow click. The light in these halls did not come from a direct source, but filtered down through high, clear-story windows, passing through layers of dust motes to arrive at the floor as a diffuse, soft gray illumination that cast no sharp shadows. It was a space of permanent solidity where the columns of polished granite stood as silent sentinels, cool to the touch, and immovable, anchoring the financial institution to the bedrock of the city, creating a sense of timeless, unhurried stability for all who entered. Fact 42. Within this cavernous hall, the interaction between the public and the ledger was mediated by the teller's cage, a structure of intricate brass and glass that enforced a polite, physical separation. The brasswork was often a lattice of scrolls and leaves, polished daily until it gleamed with a deep, golden warmth, smelling faintly of ammonia and soft rags. Between the teller and the customer stood a partition of thick, beveled glass, which muffled the voices to a low murmur, ensuring that the discussion of balances remained private and indistinct. The transaction took place through a small, arched opening at the bottom of the glass, a marble threshold where the passbook and the deposit slip were slid silently back and forth. This exchange was a choreographed movement of hands, a quiet passing of paper across the cold stone surface that required no conversation, only the rhythmic stamping of the date and the nod of acknowledgement. Fact 43. To transport these documents from the front counter to the back offices without the disruption of walking, the bank employed the pneumatic tube system, a network of brass arteries hidden behind the walls. The teller would roll the deposit slip and place it into a cylindrical canister, a capsule made of leather or hard rubber with felt washers at each end to create a seal. With a soft thwump of suction, the canister was swallowed by the tube, whisked away by a constant, invisible vacuum that hummed gently in the background of the building. The journey of the canister was a silent flight through the darkness of the ceiling voids, curving through the copper pipes with a rushing sound like wind in a tunnel, bypassing the slow friction of the physical world to arrive, moments later, with a gentle, metallic clatter in the wire basket of the central bookkeeping room, a delivery of data carried solely by the breath of the building. Fact 44. Upon arrival in the bookkeeping department, the figures were processed by the mechanical adding machine, a device of heavy cast iron and enamels that sat on the desk with the density of an anvil. Operating this machine was a rhythmic, physical task. The clerk would press the long-stemmed keys, which offered a spring-loaded resistance, and then pull the side crank with a smooth, deliberate motion to register the entry. This action engaged a complex internal assembly of gears and ratchets, which turned with a precise, oily whirring sound. Chunk, whir, click. That was the heartbeat of the office. There was no electronic hum, only the mechanical sound of calculation, a tactile process where the sum was built physically by the rotation of metal wheels, resulting in the extrusion of a narrow paper tape that curled onto the desk like a slow, white ribbon of verified truth. Fact 45. Once the sums were verified, the final records were transcribed using the typewriter, a machine that transformed the fluid motion of handwriting into the uniform staccato of print. The operator would sit before the bank of circular keys, each rimmed in nickel, and press down to activate the type bar, which swung up in a precise arc to strike the paper against the rubber platen. The sound was a steady, rhythmic patter, like heavy rain on a tin roof, punctuated by the metallic zling of the carriage return lever at the end of each line. Essential to this process was the ribbon, a strip of silk or cotton soaked in black and red ink, wound on twin spools. As the typing progressed, the ribbon would slowly unwind from one spool to the other, a microscopic movement of fabric that ensured fresh ink was always available for the next letter, creating a document of perfect mechanical consistency. Fact 46. To create a duplicate of these important documents without the labor of retyping, the clerk utilized carbon paper, a delicate, tissue-thin sheet coated on one side with a mixture of carbon, black, and wax. The assembly of the carbon sandwich was a precise precise ritual. A sheet of white paper, a sheet of carbon placed face down, its dark, waxy surface cool and smooth, and a second sheet of thin onion skin paper on top. When the typewriter key struck the top page, the force was transferred through the layers, pressing the carbon wax onto the page beneath to create a perfect, shadowy replica of the text. The carbon paper itself was fragile and crinkled with a unique, dry sound, smelling faintly of crayons and chemicals. After use, it bore the ghostly, negative stencils of the letters, a disposable memory of the transaction that left a faint blue smudge on the fingertips of the user. Fact 47. The carbon copies, once separated from the originals, were destined for the vertical filing cabinet, a monolith of olive green steel that revolutionized the storage of information. These cabinets were built to last forever, with heavy drawers that ran on telescoping tracks, fitted with steel ball bearings, allowing them to glide open with a smooth, heavy silence, even when fully loaded with paper. The sound of the drawer opening was a low metallic rumble that ceased with a soft thud as it reached its limit. Inside, the papers were not stacked flat, but stood upright, held in place by a sliding metal plate known as the compressor block. The clerk would release the compressor, creating a wedge of space, and drop the document in, then slide the plate back to squeeze the files together, ensuring that the mass of paper remained dense, organized, and upright in the darkness of the drawer. Fact 48. Holding these loose papers together was the manila folder, a simple tool of organization folded from a durable, buff-colored hemp or cardstock. The texture of the folder was slightly rough and fibrous, designed to withstand the friction of sliding in and out of the cabinet for decades without tearing. The genius of the folder lay in the tab, a small protrusion at the top edge that was cut at staggered intervals, left, center, right, to ensure visibility. The clerk would type the name of the account on a small gummed label, wet it with a sponge, and affix it to the tab, creating a permanent identifier. Opening a fresh folder involved bending back the scored lines at the bottom, allowing the folder to expand into a flat-bottomed container, a flexible vessel that grew slowly in thickness as the years of correspondence and statements accumulated within its protective fold. Fact 49. To navigate the thousands of folders hidden within the steel walls of the cabinets, the office relied on the card index system, often housed in a rotary file or a set of long, narrow wooden drawers. The index card was a stiff white rectangle of cardstock, ruled with faint red lines, containing the essential coordinates of the account, the name, the number, and the file location. These cards were often secured in the drawer by a metal rod that passed through a punched hole at the bottom center, preventing them from being removed and lost. The act of searching was a tactile rifling. The clerk's fingers would walk along the tops of the cards, flipping them forward with a rhythmic fip, fip, fip sound, until the correct name was found, a manual search algorithm that relied on the perfect alphabetical order maintained by the discipline of the filing room. Fact 50. When a file became too old to be kept in the active steel cabinets, it was retired to the archive, a basement room that smelled of dry paper, lignin, and dust. Here, the documents were transferred into banker's boxes, sturdy containers made of corrugated cardboard with double-walled construction for strength. The assembly of the box was a folding puzzle, tucking cardboard flaps into slots to create a rigid structure without the need for tape or glue. Once filled, the heavy lid was placed on top, and the box was tied shut with a cotton string wound around a plastic button. These boxes were stacked on wooden shelves that stretched to the ceiling, creating aisles of brown cardboard where the air was still and the light was dim. A final resting place where the frenetic activity of the market was distilled into a static, silent weight of history. Fact 51. In the ancient maritime world, long before the printed policy, the concept of risk was managed through the practice of bottom reading, a loan secured against the hull of the ship itself. It is a concept of deep structural trust. A lender would advance gold to a captain, not against his name, but against the physical wood and iron of the vessel floating in the harbor. If the ship returned safely, the loan was repaid with interest, a premium for the safe passage through the wind and waves. However, if the ship was lost to the sea, swallowed by the storm, or crushed against the reef, the debt died with the vessel. It was a financial agreement that acknowledged the supremacy of the ocean, a contract written with the understanding that the sea was the final arbiter of value, and that no man could owe a debt for a ship that the deep waters had claimed for themselves. Fact 52. As the trade routes expanded, the center of this risk calculation moved from the dockside to the coffee house, specifically Lloyd's of London, which began as a simple room filled with smoke and quiet conversation. In this warm, wood-paneled space, men known as underwriters sat in high-backed booths, sipping bitter coffee from small porcelain cups. The atmosphere was one of hushed deliberation. A broker would approach a booth with a slip of paper describing a ship, its cargo, and its voyage, perhaps tea from Canton or wool to Flanders. The underwriter would read the slip in silence, calculating the odds of the voyage in his mind, and if he chose to accept a portion of the risk, he would write his name literally under the text of the proposal. This physical act of writing one's name beneath the details was the origin of the term underwriter, a signature that bound a man's personal fortune to the fate of a distant, floating object. Fact 53. The primary instrument of this trade was the lutein bell, a salvaged ship's bell that hung in the center of the underwriting room, serving as the voice of fate within the market. It was an object of absolute authority. When news arrived of an overdue ship, the room would fall into a profound silence as the caller rang the bell. One stroke signaled bad news, the loss of a ship, sending a ripple of quiet resignation through the room as men adjusted their ledgers to reflect the loss. Two strokes signaled good news, the safe arrival of a vessel thought lost, bringing a collective exhale of relief. The sound of the bell was resonant and clear, a single brass note cut through the murmur of commerce, translating the chaotic reality of the ocean into a binary signal of profit or loss, a sound that lingered in the air long after the clapper had come to rest. Fact 54. To track the movements of these thousands of vessels, the industry relied on The List, a daily publication that was a masterpiece of boring, essential data, printed on thin, dense paper that rustled softly. Lloyd's List contained no stories, no opinions, no illustrations, only columns of ships' names, their captains, their locations, and their conditions. The clerk would spend hours running his finger down these columns, searching for a specific vessel. The Mary Rose, the Seafoam, the Intrepid. The entries were abbreviated and repetitive. Spoken with off Azores, past Dover, arrived sound. Reading the list was a hypnotic exercise in geography, a mental tracing of global trade routes where the only narrative was the slow incremental progress of a hull through the water, a daily confirmation that the world's commerce was proceeding with its usual plodding regularity. Fact 55. When a ship was declared a total loss, the insurance process required the abandonment, a formal legal gesture where the owner surrendered all rights to the wreck in exchange for the full value of the policy. This was a moment of release. The owner ceased to worry about the salvage, the cargo, or the crew, transferring the burden of the sunken vessel entirely to the insurers. The wreck itself, lying perhaps in the crushing darkness of the Atlantic floor or broken on a Caribbean shoal, became the property of the underwriters, a constructive total loss. It is a soothing legal fiction. The ship still exists as matter, dissolving slowly into the ocean, but as a financial entity, it has been liquidated, the stress of its ownership washed away by the signing of a paper, leaving the owner free to build again on dry land. Fact 56. For the cargoes that survived the voyage, the concept of general average provided a safety net of communal sacrifice, a rule older than the insurance companies themselves. It dictated that if a captain had to jettison some cargo to save the ship during a storm, throwing bales of silk or barrels of wine overboard to lighten the load, the loss would be shared proportionally by all merchants with goods on board. It was a principle of ultimate fairness. No single merchant would bear the tragedy of the storm alone. If your goods were saved because another man's were sacrificed to the waves, you contributed a small percentage of your value to compensate him. This calculation was complex and slow, performed by average adjusters who worked in quiet offices, balancing the weight of the thrown cargo against the value of the preserved ship. A mathematical expression of solidarity in the face of the indiscriminate sea. Fact 57. On land, the fear of fire birthed a different kind of insurance, marked physically by the fire mark, a heavy plaque of lead or iron affixed to the front of a building. These marks were painted in bright colors, gold, red, blue, and bore the emblem of the insurance company, a sun, a handshake, a castle. They were nailed high up on the brickwork, a visible signal to the private fire brigades of the time. If a fire broke out, the brigade would rush to the scene, look up through the smoke, and if they saw their company's mark, they would deploy the hoses. If not, they might stand back. The mark was a talisman of protection, a heavy, cold metal shield that hung silently on the facade through decades of rain and sun, a constant, unblinking eye that promised that if the worst happened, the mechanism of recovery was already in place. Fact 58. The actuarial tables that underpinned these policies were the result of decades of mortality data compiled into the Life Table, a document of supreme statistical inevitability. Actuaries, working in the silent, dust-mote-filled air of the back office, did not look at individuals. They looked at cohorts, great masses of people born in the same year. They traced the slow attrition of these groups over time, plotting the curve of life expectancy with a smooth, descending line. There is a strange comfort in the law of large numbers. While the fate of one man is unpredictable and anxious, the fate of a million is stable and known. The actuary's pen moved across the graph, turning the chaos of human existence into a predictable slope, a mathematical assurance that the future, in the aggregate, is nothing more than a steady, gentle decline that can be planned for, funded, and understood. Fact 59. Securing these promises was the strong box, the precursor to the modern safe, often a chest of iron-bound oak or a dedicated room lined with stone. In the early insurance offices, the collected premiums were not immediately invested in abstract stocks, but were often kept as physical specie, bags of gold and silver coins resting in the dark. The opening of the strongbox required a key ceremony, often involving multiple key holders, who had to be present simultaneously. The sound of the keys turning in the complex wardlock mechanisms was a heavy, metallic clunking, a sound of security. Inside, the bags of coins sat heavy and inert, a tangible reserve of wealth that did nothing but wait, a silent potential energy stored in the dark against the day when a claim would need to be paid. Fact 60. Finally, the policy itself, the physical document of the insurance, was designed to look and feel like a treasury bond printed on security paper with intricate gouache patterns, endless looping geometric spirals that are impossible to trace with the eye without inducing a trance. The text was often written in a dense, archaic legal language, a continuous block of hereby, wherefore, and aforesaid, printed in a small serif font that discouraged casual reading. The paper was folded into a narrow vertical packet and tied with red tape, the origin of the idiom, and placed in a pigeonhole. Once filed, the policy sat in the dark, a dormant contract of protection that required no maintenance, no batteries, and no attention, a silent promise that slept in the drawer, ready to wake only if the world turned upside down, but otherwise content to remain a quiet, folded layer of paper. Fact 61. In the late Victorian office, the connection to the external pulse of the market was mediated by the stock ticker, a machine encased within a high dome of blown glass that sat on a pedestal like a scientific specimen. The ticker did not roar. It spoke in a rhythmic, staccato, mechanical language, a series of rapid clicks and pauses that mirrored the trading floor miles away. Inside the glass, a small wheel of type spun with a blur of motion, powered by a heavy weight or a wound spring, imprinting abbreviations and fractions onto a narrow strip of paper tape. This tape, known as ticker tape, flowed endlessly from the machine like a white fluid coiling into a wire basket on the floor in a chaotic, tangled heap of data. The sound was hypnotic. Tick, 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 whir, tick. A dry, percussive song of finance that filled the room with a sense of urgent but distant activity, allowing the observer to watch the rise and fall of fortunes through the silent, protective barrier of the glass. Fact 62. Supporting the ticker was the vast, silent infrastructure of the telegraph, a network of copper wires that stretched across the landscape on wooden poles, humming in the wind. A critical component of this system was the telegraph insulator, a bell-shaped object made of thick, heavy glass or glazed ceramic, usually green or brown, screwed onto the cross arms of the pole. These insulators were designed to shed water and prevent the electrical current from leaking into the wetwood of the pole during a rainstorm. They sat motionless against the sky, row upon row of them, enduring the sun and the snow with geological patience. To stand beneath a line of telegraph poles in a quiet field was to hear the aeolian harp effect, a low, moaning resonance caused by the wind vibrating the tensioned wires, a mournful, continuous note that was the auditory shadow of the information racing silently overhead at the speed of light. Fact 63. At the center of the banking system lay the clearinghouse, a large, austere room where the chaotic debts of the city were resolved into a state of equilibrium. Every afternoon, clerks from each major bank, known as settlers, would arrive carrying leather satchels filled with bundles of checks and bills of exchange drawn on other banks. They would take their seats at a long oval table arranged in a specific traditional order. The process was one of pure exchange. There was no money, only paper. The clerk from Bank A would hand a bundle of checks to the clerk from Bank B, who would hand back a bundle of similar value. The difference, the balance, was calculated in silence and noted on a sheet. It was a room of shuffling paper and murmuring voices, a place where millions of pounds changed hands without a single gold coin ever leaving the vault, a massive, silent cancellation of debt that left the city's ledgers perfectly balanced by tea time. Fact 64. Deep beneath the street, the security of the vault was entrusted not just to steel, but to the chronometer time lock, a mechanism of Swiss precision mounted on the inside of the massive door. This device consisted of 2 or 3 high-grade clock movements, ticking in unison behind a glass plate, their gears turning slowly in the absolute darkness of the sealed vault. The time lock was a failsafe against coercion. Once the door was swung shut and the timer set, no key, no combination, and no human hand could open it until the preset hour of the next morning. The clocks would tick away, the seconds of the night in the silence of the strong room, unhurried and unstoppable, ensuring that the wealth remained frozen in time, accessible only when the sun rose and the gears aligned to release the heavy bolts that held the door fast. Fact 65. Within that vault, the ultimate store of value was the gold bar, an object of surprising density and softness. A good delivery bar, the standard of international trade, was cast from 400 troy ounces of pure gold, resulting in a brick that was far heavier than its modest size suggested, creating a cognitive dissonance when lifted. The surface of the bar was not always mirror smooth. It often bore the cooling ripples of the pour, a frozen topography of liquid metal that had solidified in the mold. Gold is a metal that does not oxidize or tarnish. A bar stored in a damp cellar for a century would emerge exactly as bright and yellow as the day it was cast. To touch it was to feel a rapid transfer of heat. Gold's high thermal conductivity meant it felt intensely cold to the warm hand, a dense, chilling block of eternal value that absorbed the warmth of the living without ever changing its own state. Fact 66. To organize the loose paperwork of the bureaucracy, the civil service and the banks relied on the humble treasury tag, a simple, ingenious device consisting of a short length of green cotton cord with a small metal T-bar at each end. The clerk would punch a hole in the corner of a stack of papers, thread the metal bar through, and flatten it, binding the documents together in a loose, flexible sheet. Unlike a staple, which is rigid and permanent, the treasury tag allowed for the file to be opened flat and for pages to be added or removed with a gentle manipulation of the string. The sight of a thick file bound by a strained green tag, the edges of the papers soft and dog-eared, evoked a sense of slow, cumulative administration, a collection of correspondence that had grown organically over years, held together by nothing more than a piece of string and the gravity of the process. Fact 67. For documents requiring absolute security, the seal was applied using sealing wax, a dense, resinous material that came in sticks of deep vermilion red or black. The process was a sensory ritual. The stick was held over a candle flame, where it would melt slowly, not into a liquid, but into a thick, viscous globule that dripped heavily onto the flap of the envelope. The smell was distinctive, acrid, piney, and smoky, while the wax was still hot and soft. The brass matrix of the seal was pressed firmly into the puddle. The wax would ooze out around the edges of the metal, cooling rapidly from a molten state to a hard, brittle solid. Once set, the seal was a permanent lock. It couldn't be bent or manipulated, only broken. The glossy, impressed image in the wax was a frozen moment of authority, a fragile guarantee that the contents had remained unseen by any eyes but the senders. Fact 68. On the desk of every clerk sat the spindle, a simple, somewhat menacing tool for temporary filing, consisting of a heavy lead or iron base supporting a long, sharp, upright spike. As receipts, notes, and orders were completed, they were spiked, thrust down onto the metal needle with a satisfying, soft shk sound of piercing paper. The papers would accumulate on the spike in reverse chronological order, a strata of the day's work, with the morning's tasks buried at the bottom and the evening's at the top. It was a system of gravity-fed archiving. There was no sorting, only the linear progression of time impaled on a metal rod. At the end of the month, the stack would be slid off, tied with string, and stored, leaving the spike bare and sharp, ready to receive the first receipt of the new cycle. Fact 69. In the quiet corners of the archive, the air was often filled with the distinct scent of old paper, a complex olfactory signal of slow chemical decay known as acid hydrolysis. The paper of the 19th and early 20th centuries, often treated with alum rose enzymes, would slowly release volatile organic compounds as the lignin in the wood pulp broke down over decades. This scent is often described as resembling vanilla, almond, or dry grass. It is the smell of a library or a deed room, a dry, sweet, and dusty aroma that hangs in the still air between the shelves. This breakdown also causes the paper to yellow and become brittle at the edges, a visual foxing that marks the passage of time. To breathe in the air of an archive is to inhale the slow molecular disintegration of history, a gentle reminder that even the most permanent records are slowly returning to the organic dust from which they came. Fact 70. Finally, patrolling these silent spaces was the night watchman, whose movements were recorded by the watchman's clock, a heavy, leather-encased device slung over his shoulder. The watchman did not merely walk. He performed a circuit of stations, key points, located at the far ends of the warehouse or the bank. At each station, a key was chained to the wall. The watchman would insert this key into his clock and turn it, a mechanical action that embossed a timestamp onto a paper dial hidden inside the locked case. The clock was a mechanical witness to his vigilance, recording his presence in the dark, empty corridors at 2:00 a.m., 3:00 a.m., 4:00 a.m. The paper dial, when removed the next morning, showed a perfect circle of punch marks, a geometric proof of a quiet, lonely night spent walking the perimeter of other people's wealth, ensuring that the silence remained undisturbed. Fact 71. The logistical backbone of the 19th century was built upon the T-rail, a length of rolled iron that was designed to support immense moving weight while remaining perfectly static. The creation of a rail was a process of gradual elongation. A red-hot bloom of iron was passed back and forth between heavy rollers, each pass squeezing the metal tighter and stretching it longer until it formed the distinctive profile with a wide base and a narrow head. Once rolled, the rails were laid out on the cooling beds, gray and straight, radiating heat into the air as they contracted. There is a deep solidity to a rail. It is a single, continuous beam of metal that offers a smooth, glass-like surface to the wheel, a pathway of least resistance that allows thousands of tons to glide across the landscape, the low, constant rumble of steel on steel. Fact 72. Supporting these rails was the sleeper or cross tie, a rectangular block of timber, usually hewn from oak or pine, chosen for its ability to absorb the vibration of the passing train. Before laying, the wood was treated in a pressure chamber with creosote, a dark, oily liquid distilled from coal tar. This process forced the preservative deep into the grain of the wood, turning it a blackish brown and imbuing it with a sharp, medicinal scent that hung over the railway tracks on hot days. The sleepers were laid in an endless, hypnotic ladder, spaced exactly 2 feet apart, stretching to the horizon. Each one was a silent shock absorber, bedding down into the earth to hold the gauge constant, dampening the noise of the wheels into a dull, rhythmic thrumming that lulled passengers to sleep. Fact 73. To lock the sleepers in place, the track was embedded in ballast, a bed of crushed, angular stones, typically granite or limestone, that had been broken into pieces small enough to pass through a 2-inch ring. The stones were not smooth river rocks which would roll and shift, but jagged fragments that interlocked with one another, creating a rigid yet permeable matrix. This stone foundation served a dual purpose. It held the track firm against the lateral forces of the train, and it allowed rainwater to drain away instantly, keeping the sleepers dry. The sound of footsteps on ballast is distinct and crunchy, a shifting, dry noise that speaks of drainage and stability, a shifting carpet of stone that supports the heavy infrastructure of transit. Fact 74. Where one rail ended and the next began, they were joined by the fish plate, a heavy steel bracket bolted through the web of the rail. Crucially, the layers of track were not touched. A small gap, known as the expansion joint, was left between the railings. This empty space was an allowance for the thermal breathing of the metal. In the heat of the summer, the iron would expand and the gap would close, and in the cold of winter, it would contract and open. This necessary imperfection in the line is the origin of the rhythmic click-clack sound of the train, a metronomic beat caused by the wheels crossing the gap, a sound that measures the distance in seconds and serves as the heartbeat of the journey. Fact 75. The interface between the train and the track was the wheel tire, a hoop of high tensile steel that was shrunk fit onto the wheel center. The process of fitting the tire relied on the physics of heat. The steel hoop was heated in a furnace until it expanded slightly, then placed over the cold wheel. As the tire cooled, it contracted with immense force, gripping the wheel so tightly that no bolts were needed to hold it in place. This bond was one of pure tension, a silent, crushing embrace that ensured the wheel acted as a single, solid unit. The surface of the tire was tapered by a few degrees, a subtle cone shape that allowed the train to self-center on the tracks, steering itself around curves through the simple geometry of rolling. Fact 76. To reduce the friction of these heavy axles spinning for thousands of miles, the railway utilized the journal box, a cast iron housing at the end of each wheel axle. Inside this dark, greasy chamber lay the brass, a curved bearing of soft metal that rested on the spinning axle, and beneath it a reservoir of oil packed with cotton waste. As the wheel turned, the cotton wickeded the oil up onto the axle, maintaining a permanent film of lubricant between the metals. The smell of a railway yard is largely the smell of this heavy, hot oil, a viscous, golden fluid that defeated heat and wear, allowing the heavy steel shafts to spin in a bath of silence, mile after mile, without grinding themselves to dust. Fact 77. Connecting the wagons of a goods train was the three-link coupling, a system of heavy, loose chains that required a distinct, slow rhythm to operate. When a train started, the locomotive would pull forward, and the sound would ripple down the line, clank, 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 as each chain pulled taut in succession, picking up the weight of the cars, one by one. Conversely, when the train braked, the wagons would buffer up, compressing the springs with a soft thud, thud, thud. This slack in the system meant that the train did not move as a rigid block, but as a segmented, fluid entity, stretching and compressing like a metal snake, the wave of motion traveling slowly through the length of the convoy. Fact 78. At the rear of every goods train sat the brake van, a heavy wooden vehicle weighted with scrap iron or concrete ballast to increase its grip on the rails. Inside, the guard sat in solitude, watching the line recede through the rear windows. His primary tool was a large, horizontal handrail that operated the mechanical screw brake. On long descents, the guard would slowly turn the wheel, pressing wooden blocks against the wheels of the van to create drag, keeping the coupling chains taut and preventing the wagons from bumping into the engine. It was a job of friction and vigilance, sitting in the swaying cabin, listening to the squeal of the blocks, feeling the heat radiating through the floorboards, acting as the heavy anchor for the train. Fact 79. When a wagon was not in use, it was shunted into the siding, a spur of track that dead-ended into a buffer stop. The siding was a place of logistical rest, where the rails were often rusty from disuse and weeds grew up through the ballast, brushing against the axles. Here, the rolling stock would sit for days or weeks, stationary and silent, forming long lines of waiting inventory. The buffer stop at the end was often a heavy construction of rail and timber, sometimes piled with earth, designed to catch a drifting wagon. The siding represents the pause in the economy, the reservoir of capacity, where the heavy industrial assets sleep under the open sky, waiting for the signal to rejoin the main line. Fact 80. Finally, we consider the turntable, a massive circular platform set into a pit in the ground designed to turn the locomotive. The engine would steam slowly onto the bridge of the table, balancing its hundreds of tons on a central pivot bearing. Once balanced, the entire mechanism could be pushed by just a few men or a small motor, rotating with a smooth, silent grace. It is a mesmerizing sight, the enormous black machine floating and turning in slow motion, the connecting rods gleaming until it aligns perfectly with the outbound track. The locking bolt would slide home with a heavy clunk, and the engine, now facing the opposite direction, would be ready to return the way it came, completing the cycle of the line. Fact 81. Before the speed of the railway, the heavy logistics of the Industrial Revolution floated silently upon the cut, the artificial canal network that served as the arterial system of commerce. The fundamental mechanism of this network was the canal lock, a chamber of wet brick and stone that functioned as a hydraulic elevator for boats. To operate a lock was a slow, muscular meditation. The boatman would lean his back against the heavy wooden balance beam of the gate, pushing with a steady, grinding momentum until the miter gates met perfectly against the stream, creating a watertight seal. With the turn of a rack and pinion gear, the paddles, submerged deep underwater, would slide open, allowing the water to rush into the chamber, not with a roar, but with a deep, gurgling upwelling, slowly lifting the 40-ton barge inch by inch until it reached the level of the upper pound, a process of levitation powered entirely by gravity and patience. Fact 82. The vessel designed for these narrow waterways was the narrowboat, a craft of unique proportions, measuring exactly 7 feet wide to fit the tightest locks. These boats were painted in bright, geometric roses and castles, but their hull was a dark, tarred steel that sat low in the water, heavy with coal or pottery. The movement of a narrowboat is the definition of lethargy. It has no keel, but a flat bottom. It slides over the mud and the water with a maximum speed of 4 miles per hour, a pace indistinguishable from a brisk walk. Steering was done with a massive wooden tiller, the ellum, which required small intuitive adjustments. The steerer would stand at the stern, feeling the vibration of the water through the wood, guiding the heavy length of the boat around the winding contours of the countryside with a silent, drifting precision. Fact 83. Propelling these boats before the diesel engine was the horse, walking along the towpath, a beaten track of earth and cinder that ran parallel to the water. The connection between the animal and the vessel was the tow line, a long rope of hemp or sisal that dipped and rose in a catenary arc over the water. There was a specific silence to this mode of transport. The horse's hooves were often muffled by the soft ground, and the boat made no engine noise, only the soft swish of the bow cutting the water. The tension in the rope was a living thing. If the boat drifted too close to the bank, the rope would slacken, dipping into the water with a wet slap. As the horse pulled, it would snap tight again, shedding droplets of canal water in a mist, maintaining the silent, elastic bond between the motive power and the cargo. Fact 84. Moving from the transport to the commodity, we enter the bonded warehouse, a cathedral of commerce, where goods like wool, tobacco, and spirits were stored under the joint custody of the merchant and the customs officer. The legal status of these goods was suspended. They were technically on British soil, but for tax purposes had not yet entered the country. The doors of these warehouses were secured with 2 padlocks, one for the merchant, one for the crown, meaning neither could enter without the other. Inside, the air was cool, dark, and thick, with the scent of lanolin and raw fleece. The bales of wool were stacked to the ceiling, dense blocks of potential fabric that absorbed all sound, creating a muffled, hushed acoustic environment where the only activity was the slow settling of dust and the aging of the inventory in the dark. Fact 85. The processing of this wool began with carding, a mechanical brushing that aligned the chaotic fibers into a parallel sheet. The carding engine consisted of large cylinders covered in thousands of fine wire teeth, revolving against one another with a mesmerizing, humming precision. The raw, tangled clumps of wool were fed in at one end and passed between the rollers, which gently teased the fibers apart without breaking them. The result was the web, a ghost-like, translucent film of fibers that was so delicate it could barely be felt, floating off the final cylinder to be gathered into a soft, untwisted rope known as a sliver. The visual effect of the carding machine is one of continuous, flowing gray clouds, a relentless, soft grooming that transformed the organic mess of nature into the orderly discipline of industry. Fact 86. This sliver was then drawn out and twisted into yarn by the spinning mule, a machine that moved with a hypnotic, respiratory rhythm. The carriage of the mule, carrying hundreds of spindles, would retreat from the rollers on a track, drawing out the thread as it moved. The draw. Then it would pause for a microsecond to twist the thread before rolling back in towards the frame. The backing off, to wind the finished yarn onto the cot. The motion was like a slow tide, the carriage moving out and in, over a span of several feet. The watchers in the mill would fall into a trance state known as mule gazing, their eyes following the synchronized dance of the white threads stretching and winding, a mechanical breathing that produced the literal thread of the economy. Fact 87. Once spun, the yarn entered the loom, where the shuttle became the instrument of the weave. In the flying shuttle loom, the shuttle was a smooth, boat-shaped block of dense wood, tipped with steel, which carried the weft thread across the warp. The motion was too fast for the eye to track individually, but the rhythm was a steady, rhythmic clack, whoosh, clack. However, in the slower, hand-operated looms of the pattern weavers, the process was a gentle passing of the shuttle from hand to hand through the shed, the gap in the threads. The weaver would press the foot treadle to lift the alternate threads, slide the smooth wood through, and then pull the beater forward to press the new thread against the cloth. A repetitive, rocking motion that slowly built the fabric line by line, a physical accumulation of patience. Fact 88. The finished cloth was not immediately sold, but was sent to the perching table for inspection, a task performed in the best natural light of the mill, usually under a north-facing window. The inspector, or percher, would pull the long bolt of fabric over a slanted wooden table, running his hands over the surface to feel for knots, burrs, or irregularities. It was a tactile quality control. The eye watched the weave, but the hand judged the texture. The sound was the soft, dry friction of cloth sliding over wood. If a defect was found, a small string was tied to the selvage, the edge to mark it. The percher worked in silence, a critic of texture, ensuring that the thousands of yards of gabardine or worsted wool were uniform, smooth, and perfect to the touch. Fact 89. To ship these textiles to the markets of the world, they were compressed into the bale, a dense geometric package created by a hydraulic press. The folded cloth was stacked high in the press, and the heavy platen descended, squeezing the air out of the fabric with tons of pressure until the pile was reduced to a fraction of its original height. While under this immense compression, the bale was wrapped in Hessian sacking and bound with steel bands, or hoop iron, which were riveted shut. When the pressure was released, the cloth tried to expand, but was held in check by the iron, creating a package that was hard as wood and incredibly dense, a stored energy of compression that allowed soft fabric to be handled like bricks of cargo in the hold of a ship. Fact 90. Finally, the memory of the textile trade was preserved in the sample book, a heavy, ledger-like volume that served as the catalog of the mill's output. These books were thick and bound in leather, filled with pages of stiff cardstock. On each page, small rectangles of fabric were glued in neat rows, tweeds, herringbones, serges, each with a handwritten number and a description of the weight and dye. To browse a sample book is to turn through a library of textures. The fingertips graze over the rough wool, the smooth cotton, and the cool silk. These books were often kept in the office safe, treated as valuable archives of intellectual property. They smell of old glue and dust, silent encyclopedias of pattern that document the seasonal shifts in taste and the endless, subtle variations of the warp and the weft. Fact 91. To economize on the cost of the telegraph, which charged by the word, the commercial world developed the telegraphic code book, a dense volume of encryption that turned sentences into single, nonsensical words. The most famous, Bentley's complete phrase code, was a book of lists where a merchant could look up the word dabber and find that it meant the market is very quiet, or dabchick, meaning the market is rising slowly. The act of decoding a telegram was a silent, scholarly translation. The clerk would receive the slip of paper containing a string of 5-letter words, open the heavy code book, and run his finger down the columns of small print. It was a process of expanding the compressed language back into meaning, turning the cryptic, short-form signals of the wire into the polite, full sentences of commerce, restoring the flow of the narrative from the staccato rhythm of the machine. Fact 92. For the holder of bearer bonds, the extraction of value was a physical ritual known as coupon clipping, performed twice a year in the privacy of the study. The bond certificate was a large, ornate document, and attached to the bottom was a sheet of small, perforated rectangles. The coupons, each printed with a date and a currency amount. To claim the interest, the owner had to take a pair of sharp scissors and carefully cut along the dotted line, severing the coupon from the main sheet. The sound was a crisp, dry snip-snip, a delicate surgery on paper that required a steady hand to avoid damaging the certificate. These small clippings were then gathered in a pile, like confetti of value, and taken to the bank teller, who would exchange the paper scraps for cash without a word, honoring the anonymity of the bearer. Fact 93. When a merchant traveled, he carried his wealth not in gold, but in a letter of credit, a formal document that functioned as a passport for money. This heavy, folded paper was addressed to a network of correspondent banks around the world, introducing the bearer and requesting that he be given funds up to a certain limit. On the back of the letter was a grid where each bank would record the amount withdrawn, the date, and the location. As the traveler moved from London to Paris to Rome, the back of the letter, filled with the handwriting of different clerks and the stamps of different cities, a slow, bureaucratic log of the journey. It was a document that accumulated history, a single sheet of paper that grew heavier with ink as the traveler moved further from home, stitching together the distant outposts of banking into a single trusted line. Fact 94. In the quietest corner of the ledger lay the depreciation schedule, a table that tracked the slow and visible decay of the company's physical assets. It is a concept of mathematical melancholy. The accountant acknowledges that the factory walls are weathering, the machinery is wearing down, and the ships are aging, even if they look unchanged to the eye. Each year, a percentage of the value is written off, a non-cash expense that represents the friction of time itself. The entry is made in silence. No money leaves the bank. No check is written. It is merely the recognition that all material things are returning to the dust, a gentle subtraction that lowers the value of the asset column, year by year, tracing a smooth, downward curve toward zero, where the object finally comes to rest on the books. Fact 95. The verification of these accounts was the domain of the auditor, whose primary tool was the tick mark, a small rhythmic gesture of the pen. The auditor would sit with the ledger, checking each entry against a voucher or a receipt, and upon being satisfied, would place a small tick in colored ink, often green or purple, next to the figure. The motion of ticking is repetitive and hypnotic. Read, verify, tick, read, verify, tick. It is a binary language of truth. The absence of a tick meant uncertainty, but the presence of the mark meant that the number was solid, anchored, and real. A fully audited page was a field of these small, colored, distinct marks, a visual proof that every transaction had been seen, weighed, and approved by a second set of eyes, allowing the book to be closed with confidence. Fact 96, deep within the office was the stationery cupboard, a windowless room that smelled intensely of dry paper, cardboard, and gum arabic. This was the reservoir of potential bureaucracy, where stacks of pristine, cream-colored ledger paper sat in reams, wrapped in brown craft paper. There were boxes of new nibs, untouched bottles of ink, and balls of red string, all resting in the dark on wooden shelves. To enter the stationery cupboard was to enter a space of absolute stillness, where the supplies waited in suspended animation for the moment they would be called into service. The air was dry and still, preserving the crispness of the envelopes and the stickiness of the labels. Quiet inventory of blank slates waiting to be written upon. Fact 97. Regulating the tempo of the entire operation was the regulator clock, a precision timepiece with a heavy, mercury-filled pendulum that hung on the wall of the main hall. The swing of the pendulum was slow and deliberate, a visual and auditory metronome that divided the day into equal and partial seconds. The mercury in the pendulum bob compensated for temperature changes, expanding or contracting to keep the center of gravity constant, ensuring that the time didn't drift with the weather. The sound of the clock was a slow heartbeat like tock, 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 a sound that became invisible to the workers during the day, but dominated the room in the silence of the evening, marking the passage of time with a relentless mechanical indifference that outlasted every transaction. Fact 98. When a ledger was finally filled, it was moved to the archive, a basement room often located beneath the pavement level, where the light was dim and the air was cool. The books were placed on shelves according to year, their leather spines facing out like tiles on a wall. Over time, these books would gather a layer of archive dust, fine gray powder that is distinct from ordinary house dust. It is the result of the slow disintegration of paper fibers and leather binding, a soft, velvety coating that muffles sound and dulls the colors of the spines. The archivist moves through this space softly, disturbing the air as little as possible, allowing the dust to settle back onto the tops of the books, sealing them under a blanket of silence that deepens with every passing decade. Fact 99. At the end of the fiscal year, the accountant performed the closing of the books, a ritual that drew a line under the activities of the past 12 months. Every revenue and expense account was summed up and transferred to the profit and loss account, leaving the temporary accounts empty, zeroed out, and ready for the new year. It was a cleansing process, a sweeping away of the details to leave only the net result. The final entry was a moment of profound completion. The ink was blotted, the page was turned, and the heavy book was shut. The complexity of a year's trade, the storms, the risks, the noise, was compressed into a single, final figure, a resting point that allowed the organization to sleep before the cycle began again. 100. To signify this finality, the clerk would draw the double red line beneath the total, a universal symbol of conclusion. In the language of accounting, he would take his ruler, flip it to the beveled edge to prevent smudging, and dip his ruling pen into the vermilion ink. With a steady hand, he would draw the first line, thin and precise, across the bottom of the column. Then, moving the ruler down a fraction of an inch, he would draw the second line, parallel and equal to the first. This double line meant stop. It meant that no further additions could be made, that the calculation was finished, the balance was struck, and the story of the numbers had come to a definitive, irrevocable end. The pen was laid down, the book was closed, the lamp was extinguished, and the room was left to the darkness and the silence.